Good afternoon. Welcome back. Yesterday, Monday, the 27th of January, was the National Day of Remembrance of the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, as it should be. And as people of good conscience and goodwill commemorated those atrocities, around 650,000 displaced Palestinians began returning to the massive destruction of North Gaza in historic Palestine. CovertAction Magazine has a piece entitled, "Women in the Biden Administration Complicit in the Israeli Genocide of Gaza." It reads, quote, "As people in the United States sat down to Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners this past holiday season, Palestinians in Gaza on day 419 of the Israeli genocide of Gaza and U.S. complicity in that genocide were facing starvation, lack of water, tents, purposefully destroyed by U.S. bombs dropped by Israeli warplanes and drones, and rain and cold from the winter storms." It continues, "Here in the U.S., families enjoyed meals prepared primarily by mothers and wives. Yet, many mothers and wives and aunties of these families had day jobs with the Biden administration and were key participants in the U.S. complicity in the Israeli genocide of the 44,000 Palestinians in Gaza whom we know have been killed by U.S. weapons, the hundreds of thousands who have been injured, and perhaps the 100,000 who were buried beneath the rubble." What are we to make of this or these incredible contradictions? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they take place in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which most events occur. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic contexts in which they take place, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze these events that impact the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is the role of women in these historic, deplorable, horrific, genocidal policies. What has happened to what we've always been told are the motherly instincts and compassion inherent in women? Let's turn to my guest. He holds a PhD in American history from Brandeis University. He's a managing editor of CovertAction Magazine. He's also the author of 5 books on U.S. foreign policy. Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. Jeremy, welcome back.
Great to be with you.
Your thoughts on how I framed this discussion, because the author of this piece, retired Colonel Ann Wright, writes, quote, "As women, wives, mothers, and grandmothers, one who would have hoped that these women policymakers and policy implementers would have attempted to stop the Biden administration's complete and total unwavering support of the state of Israel as the Israeli government shocked the world with its extreme retaliation and retribution against Hamas and the Palestinian people after the horrific events of October 7th, 2023. Your thoughts, Jeremy? So those also, because I want to reiterate to those that are thinking that this might be some kind of sexist conversation, it was written by retired Colonel Ann Wright. Jeremy Kuzmarov.
Well, yeah, I think Colonel Wright was just expressing her disappointment that, there's hope, the feminist movement, represented such high ideals. And for years, women were often excluded from top policy roles, and that was not right. And the hope was that women were more, compassionate and would put an end to these senseless wars and not be staunch advocates for them. Unfortunately, we see, really, it's kind of the institution that's bankrupt, and whoever fits, gets into that institution has to play a certain function, so it doesn't seem to matter if they're men or women. It's the same policies we're seeing. And we've seen some women, at the forefront of her list are women like Samantha Power, who is also a gung-ho war hawk on Libya and the destruction of Libya that I think we've discussed on this show. She was at the top of that. In fact, she was more hawkish than a lot of the conservative male military officers in pushing for intervention, along with Hillary Clinton in the Obama administration. And she invoked human rights to justify military intervention that has had the effect of as you described, destroying the human rights and human dignity of the people and killing them. I guess we see the limits of gender and feminism in the face of these monstrous institutions and the U.S. government representing the capitalist elite in the United States that have this drive for empire and bases in the Middle East, and use, in the case of Israel, Gaza, they use Israel, their proxy in the Middle East, to gain more power and influence and control over the oil, and to divide the Arab people and subjugate the more radical nationalistic Arabs. So they're gung-ho and zealously supporting the Greater Israel Project and the destruction of the Palestinian people and other Israeli aggression. And it doesn't matter that there are more women in Washington. It's the ruling capitalist elite that has, for years, used Israel as its tool in the Middle East, and it's culminated in this horrific genocide.
One of the things that we've heard in the rhetoric as we were looking at the 2016 campaign with Hillary Clinton, as we were looking at the 2024 campaign with Kamala Harris, one of the things that would be noted is, we would be better off with women at the helm because women are more compassionate. Women bring a sensibility that is tied to motherhood. There are some innate qualities in women that make them more reasonable, make them more rational, and also make them less warlike. And what we see with the list of women that Colonel Wright has laid out in her article, one only can say, au contraire.
Yeah, well, I know Colonel Wright well. She's a wonderful person, and I brought her to my class. I used to teach at the University of Tulsa, and I met her at a conference, and she's from Arkansas, so she told me she was going to visit her family. So I said, why don't you come and visit my university and give a lecture, because it was near where her family lives. So she came, and actually, she told the students she wasn't the regular class visitor. And this was, a course on U.S. foreign policy. I think it was a course on the CIA. And, when she came in, she asked the student who was interested in maybe having a career in the U.S. State Department. And a few raised their hand. And she said, well, it's a nice career, but you'll sell your soul. And I think that's what we're seeing. It's the institution. What we're seeing is that some of these women are probably very nice women, very nice to their families. They have a lot of good personal qualities, but once they enter that institutional role, they're serving their master, and humanity gets checked out the door. And I mean, the State Department, it's out for U.S. power interests when they address international conflicts. It's a kind of Brzezinski grand chessboard approach where you're trying to advance American interests or what you perceive as that an American power, and you're never, you're not thinking about the human, human consequences of war. So, yeah, I think it's the institution that's evil. But that's what Hannah Arendt, if you go back to the Eichmann trial, Hannah Arendt was a brilliant intellectual who wrote an article on the banality of evil, focused on Adolf Eichmann. And what she found was that, because she followed that trial very carefully, and he was, at the top of the Nazi party, and he did a lot of the planning for the concentration camps and just the technical dimensions. He was a very good manager. And she found he was just a regular kind of businessman. He, had normal human qualities about him, and that's what was so chilling to her, because he was somehow so devoid from the human lives. Because he was developing the plans to send them to the concentration camps, and here's this just kind of mild-mannered accountant type. And that's what you'd find with a lot of these women, probably. I mean, I don't know the ones she discusses in her article, but I have been around women who've had powerful positions, and they're perfectly nice people. But once they enter that institutional role, they become these kind of monsters, and they can be involved in these either, horrific. I mean, the genocide in Gaza is not that different from Libya. And the war, the horrific violence that the U.S. military and France and Britain unleashed on Libya to overthrow the Gaddafi government was pretty horrific, and an approaching level of genocide. Iraq, Afghanistan, these are quasi-genocidal invasions by the U.S. military. And there were a lot of women helping to plan the war operations, or women serving in the military. So I don't think it's necessarily anything new. And again, it's just the institutional role they're fulfilling. And any human can be involved in these kind of horrors. And some of it is that they're removed from the scene. They don't feel the emotions of those who are suffering from the policy they're helping to cause, especially in this age of drone warfare. And there's a very small number of no American casualties, and small number of Israeli casualties with the high technology they use. So it further distances them from the horrors on the ground that have been going on in Gaza or these other places like Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, where the people have suffered immeasurably, much like in Gaza.
Well, also, because you mentioned the list of women on the article, and just to give some idea, the first person listed is Vice President Harris. Then she talks about Joe Biden, Linda Thomas Greenfield, Samantha Power, Karine Jean-Pierre. There are a whole lot of Evan Ryan, wife of the Secretary Tony Blinken. There are a number of folks that she lists here. And all of them, when you see those names, you got to shake your head and say, well, and Rampelsense talks about Susan Rice. It's a very long list.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. It's a very long, duplicitous list.
Absolutely, and that's what she said. I mean, people make a bargain, whether they're male or female, at some point in their lives. If they're out, unfortunately, some people, ambition gets the better of them. I mean, they're ambitious; they want to become powerful people, so they're not going to challenge policy in any way. They're going to carry out the existing policy, which was to support Israel in this case to the hilt. And you can compile a similar list with Ukraine. The horrors we've seen, and the horror of U.S. weapons used to kill for years the people of eastern Ukraine. So they made that bargain that they're out for their personal career, and they're only a small. She does profile the numbers who resigned over the Gaza genocide.
Mm-hmm.
And there was, a small number who did resign. So it showed there are some people with a conscience out there, and at some point they reach their limit and they realize they can't personally live with themselves anymore. In doing that. So I'm glad there are some people like that. But you can find that in almost all careers, I think, where people are just so ambitious and out for power that they're willing to sacrifice other people's lives. Now, obviously, this is a very extreme case.
Yeah, genocide is an
Yeah,
extreme case.
it's sad that Moore didn't, take a step back and say, is my career really worth it? On what page of history am I going to be when I, have kids or grandkids or nephews? What are they going to say? It's going to be in the history books that the Israeli army massacred tens of thousands of Palestinians and forced the rest to flee, and they lived in absolute misery. What were you doing? Well, I was in the State Department coordinating the weapons supplies. I don't think is going to, go over that well with younger generations. So, how are they going to think of you? I grew up, in a Jewish family, learning about the Holocaust and the evil of the Nazis, and inspired me. I never wanted to be on the side of the oppressor because, I think, okay, yeah, sure, the Nazis were in power and the Jews were the victims, but now, years later, when kids learn about it, that's the evil, the Nazi or the apparatchik, like the Eichmann, who maybe he didn't, kill the Jew directly, but he was in the offices doing the planning. And as a kid learning about that, I don't want to be on the side of the Nazis. So anytime there's a world conflict, I don't want to be on the side of the oppressor. And I imagine most people would be the same, but I don't know. Yeah.
Well, in fact, take a minute, if you would, please. And in my open, I drew the contrast between yesterday being the 80th commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz, but then said at the same time that people are commemorating that, there's a whole nother group of people being subjected to a very similar circumstance. And Daniel Drazenovich, thank you for your super sticker. Am I wrong? Is it anti-Semitic for me to draw that to make that comparison?
Absolutely not. I recently read a book by Rafit Al-Arir that I reviewed, and I'll have an article coming out. And it reminded me, yeah, because I read a lot of the Holocaust literature, and I, in fact, taught courses on the history of the Holocaust. Most recent, just a few years ago, was the last time I taught it. And, I'm familiar with a lot of that Holocaust literature, including Elie Wiesel's Night. And reading the Rafit Al-Arir book reminded me of Night, because he was describing, this is a Palestinian professor of English who sadly is now deceased, who was just writing about what it was like to live under a constant Israeli bombardment and attack over a decade. And he was discussing the 2009 Israeli attacks. I think it was one was Cast Lead, one was Protective Ed, 2014. And he's like, it's typical. I've lost, like 20 members of my family. My wife has lost 20 members. And he's just describing horrific incidents and horrific what it's like living under these bombing rages. And this is even before the most recent assault. And it is, I have it on my bookshelf next to Night. It's like, reading kind of the same story of what these people have endured. And there's no compassion. Of how they were displaced. They're just called terrorists when they were living, in what is today Israel, and they were displaced from their homes, and then they're called terrorists. But it's never acknowledged that they were brutalized and moved off their land, and most of their reaction has been peaceful. And in fact, the Israeli far right is what founded Hamas, because they didn't want to enter into peace negotiation with the PLO, so they created a more militant group, Hamas. So yeah, I find I find it ridiculous and also sad. That the Jewish community has stooped to this level. The ones that are pushing this, because don't forget, a lot of Jewish people are uneasy and unhappy with Israeli policy and are ashamed because, and I'm among those. I mean, I value my religion. I'm not a religious person, but I occasionally go to synagogue. I like the holidays. My family celebrated the Jewish holidays. I'm proud to be a Jewish person. I'm conscious of the Jewish history, how Jews were often oppressed and stood up for oppressed groups. And this is not something I want to identify in any way. The brutal conduct of the Israeli military, nor the far right in Israel that does not want to negotiate with the Palestinian and wants to drive them off their land. There's nothing in the Jewish religion that promote that kind of behavior. And there are many Jewish people stand in solidarity with the Palestinian victims and want some kind of settlement so the people can live in harmony. So I don't have any value for anyone who claims that it's anti-Semitic to speak out against these warfare policies and horrific massacres. I don't find any value in that claim. And I've heard a lot of the protesters. I've been to a number of them. I never really heard any anti-Semitic remarks by people who are criticizing Israeli policy or U.S. weapon supplies. And I found a lot of Jewish people at those protests. I did an article on peace activists in San Francisco who are trying to block the arms supplies. And it's a Jewish woman, One Kaufman, was one of the leaders of that effort. And she loves Israel. She goes there all the time. She has family there. But she's not going to identify with this kind of genocidal policy, nor with this extremist government. Because don't forget, this is the far, far right of the Israeli spectrum that has taken over. If you look in Israeli history, there were more, reasonable people who wanted to, have coexistence with the Palestinians, not these far right fanatics who want to drive them off their land permanently and just destroy them.
Well, in fact, to that point, I say all the time, and I'd like for you, please, to elaborate on this, that not all Jews are Zionists and not all Zionists are Jews. And that this really, when you look at the atrocities that were committed during World War II, that was Adolf Hitler and his cronies attacking a religion, a group of people based upon the religion that they practiced. When we look now at what is transpiring in historic Palestine, that religion has been hijacked by the Zionists and is used as a cover to protect them against the critique and the criticism that they have conflated Zionism with Judaism. Your thoughts?
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's a complex issue. I'm not personally against the concept of Zionism. I think there was legitimate basis that the Jewish people faced oppression in the face of the Holocaust. There were elements of the Zionist movement led by a figure like Ahad Ha'am and ultimately Martin Buber, Albert Einstein, and Noam Chomsky, who emphasized, cooperation with the Palestinian, that Jewish settlement was not the evil. The evil was if you're going to drive the Palestinian out. The hardline elements in that movement who were intent on driving the Palestinians out and had no regard for them, or and viewed them in kind of racist terms. So, I mean, there were elements of the Zionist movement from the beginning, and Ahad Ha'am was a pioneer in the revitalization of the Hebrew language, who wanted to live in harmony, who said the Zionist project would only be a success if there was cooperation with the Palestinian and mutual respect. But unfortunately, that has not come to pass. Certainly, with not this government in place in Israel. So that the Zionist movement became tainted by some of the more extreme elements, and it was also tainted because the colonial powers used it for their own purpose. They wanted to divide the Arab world and undermine, Arab nationalist forces and radicals. So they came to finance, the Zionist settlement and supported the Israeli project, and the Arab world saw it as a colonial creation. So that's caused problems. But from my point of view, there was a legitimate basis for the Zionist movement. If you look at the Dreyfus Affair, I mean, it really took off in France after the Dreyfus Affair, when they had the persecution of this Jewish army officer who was falsely accused of treason. And then you had the pogroms in Russia and a prelude to the Holocaust. So, I mean, Jewish people, who joined that movement had some legitimate, cause. And there were good elements in that movement, but there was the Jabotinsky. See, Netanyahu was an heir of the far right, Zev Jabotinsky, and in fact, his father worked as a secretary for Zev Jabotinsky, had a more fascist outlook and racist attitude toward the Arabs, and unfortunately, that's the wing that has prevailed now and over time, and that has tainted the movement. So that's just my point of view. But I agree, there are a lot of Jewish people who don't think that Zionism was bad from the outset, that it wasn't a good idea, and they have some legitimate grounds for that.
Melissa W., thank you so much for that super sticker. And I wanted to follow, before we move on, I wanted to follow up on one more point 2 points. One, it's amazing how the United States still tries to cover its action by claiming to be defending human rights when in fact it is backing genocide, which last I checked was kind of anti-human rights. It also claims to be defending democracy, as the United States says, oh, we've got to prevail in Ukraine because we're defending democracy, when the United States overthrew the democratically elected government in Ukraine in 2014, and has tried to no success to overthrow, for example, the democratically elected president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro.
Absolutely, yeah. And in Ukraine, he's canceled the elections, and they're trying to defend that. And they call Putin a dictator. Now, when they've had, Russia did have elections. I mean, you can question how fair or open those elections were, but in Ukraine's case, they've canceled it. So why not call him a dictator? And in fact, he's banned 12 parties. Zelensky, he banned 12 parties. Opposition figures have been murdered, including in Russia. The head of the Socialist Party of Ukraine's parliament was murdered in Moscow by Zelensky's henchmen. Putin, they can never provide proof that Putin, for instance, was behind the death of Navalny. And in fact, it was admitted that there was no link found there. So it's like the opposite, and that's just one case. Yeah. Look in Latin America, exactly. They tried to overthrow, they backed a coup in Bolivia. In Nicaragua, they mounted a coup attempt in 2018.
Right.
The case of Venezuela. They're supporting a brutal dictator in El Salvador. This is not getting a lot of attention, but I started following this a bit. The brutal measure, the Salvadorian leader, Nayib Bukele, has enacted this vicious war on gangs, like modeled after what he was doing in the Philippines with Duterte, where he's just like locked, any young man, he's basically taking off the streets. If you have a cousin who they accuse of being a gang member, you're getting arrested. And he said, I don't care if they're innocent. He's like taking so many innocent people and throwing them in prison. And their prisons are so overfilled now that the these human rights groups, because they've issued reports on just horrific prison conditions in El Salvador, because they've arrested all the young males in certain neighborhoods, and they don't have the money to feed them or treat them properly in prison. So this is one of the human rights horror shows going on in our hemisphere. And he's adopted increasingly authoritarian measures, and he's a favorite of Marco Rubio. So they love this kind of, basically a fascist. Look at Rwanda just invaded Congo again. They've invaded it so many times, and this leader Paul Kagame has been in power in Rwanda for decades, and he's killed so many people and hunted them down in different countries and killed them. And he's just a stone cold killer. And there are books about him calling him the African Hitler. And he's been lavished with aid for decades by the United States government. And Bill Clinton called him the greatest leader, or greatest Democrat in modern Africa. And Clinton's very, very close to him. So I mean, the hypocrisy is staggering. And Samantha Power is the biggest hypocrite. I followed her career, and I believe she is a fraud. I reviewed her book, A Problem from Hell: America in the Age of Genocide, and she's an amateur historian. Her historical coverage is terrible in that book. And she supports war propagandists, and she distorts all these conflicts like Rwanda, where it's claimed America did nothing in the genocide, but in fact America was supporting Paul Kagame from the beginning, who's killed millions of, I would say, probably millions of people, and she's a champion of his regime. She is just I consider her evil, and she's a top figure in supporting the Gaza genocide, and she was a key architect of the Libyan war. She was more hawkish than Robert Gates of the CIA and others, and she uses human rights, so we have to save them from genocide. But she's actually distorting almost every world conflict, and America is often on the side of the worst human rights violators. Anyway, I can go on about her, but
and she, along with Hillary Clinton, were key in convincing Barack Obama to go into Libya, because initially, from what I understood, he didn't really want to do it, and they convinced him that was the move that needed to be made. There's another great piece sticking with what's happening right now in Gaza. There's a great piece, Christopher Helali. It's an exclusive interview with Hamas. He interviews two members of the Hamas political bureau. One of them is Bassem Naim. And Dr. Naim says, "We believe that the American policies are not representing the wish and the will of most of the Americans," which is true, because any human being who believes in justice and peace, he will stand on the right side of history to support the oppressed people and the just cause of the Palestine people. What we are struggling for and what we are fighting for now for 75 years or more is how to get rid of the occupation, how to live like any other people in peace and security, how to secure a better and prosperous future for our children, how the Palestinian people, who are really very ambitious, can participate with other people, other nations around the world, for the goodwill of all people around the world. That's very clear, and everything I've read and heard, that is and has been the objective of the struggle.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately we're fed that conflict through a very distorted prism that just looks at Hamas or Palestinian as terrorists and doesn't look at the historical context. It relates to the theme of the show, connecting the dots. And I mean, you have to look at the history and see how this conflict originated. And you had this Zionist project, and from my analysis, there was there was a legitimate basis for, and there were some good elements, but then these hardline elements took over, who just carried out an ethnic cleansing operation, displaced the Palestinians, and then after the 6-Day War, the Israelis established a military occupation over Gaza, which had been part of Egypt. And then they undermined the secular Palestinian Liberation Organization by helping to finance and create Hamas, who are more militant, and then they could paint them as terrorists, and then they could legitimize walking out of the peace talks, which had started and were developing in the 1990s, because the Israeli far right didn't want peace with the Palestinian. They want to wipe them out, and they're fulfilling their plan now. That's been the long goal of the Jabotinsky fascist elements in Israel. So yeah, I mean, I think it's worth hearing out Hamas leaders and just to understand their point of view on the conflict and how the conflict could be ended. I mean, their plight has to be recognized, that the people were displaced. They've been mistreated, as Jews were mistreated historically. And there has to be some kind of diplomacy to move forward so that their rights are granted to them, and that they're granted what they deserve, statehood, and some of their land back. And the terms would have to be worked out. But so
you wrote another piece you wrote this piece that I found to be very, very interesting. Tom Cotton as new head of Senate Select Committee on Intelligence is Frank Church's worst nightmare. Why, Dr. Kuzmarov?
Well, because the Church Committee was a very significant committee in American history, and this was, I think, a good moment of the American Congress. Church organized these hearings to expose CIA abuses during the Cold War, whether it was the assassination plots against Fidel Castro and other leaders, whether it was nefarious mind control experiments under MK Ultra, whether it was coup plots or other skullduggery in foreign nations. And then, so that was brought out in the open, that the CIA had done all these terrible and illegal things. And part of the remedy was to set up congressional oversight and watchdog committees. And the Senate Intelligence Committee was set up for that purpose. But unfortunately, it got hijacked pretty quickly. And the CIA mobilized to ensure Frank Church's defeat. Church was a congressman from North Dakota, or was it Idaho, I think, from the Democratic Party. They engineered his defeat in the 1980 election, and then they staffed these committees with pro-CIA people like Joe Biden and Barry Goldwater, who made sure that they didn't live up to their promise of trying to hold the CIA accountable and investigating things that they were doing, which the American public ought to know about. It's our taxpayer dollar. And they covered up what they're doing, and they would only selectively investigate a few things and cover up the rest. And over time, it's got worse and worse. And now you have Tom Cotton heading the Senate Intelligence Committee, who this rabid war hawk neoconservative, who says, and this like cowboy, this idiot cowboy type, who's like, we need more CIA covert activity. We got to ramp that up worldwide. As if he doesn't know what happened in Iran in 1953 or Guatemala in 1954 or with the Bay of Pigs or the Chile fascist coup that the CIA was behind, or the Phoenix Project. I mean, do people want more of that? He wants that.
I would say maybe he does.
He does want that, and now he's not going to invest it. He wants the CIA to carry out more covert activity when his committee is supposed to be investigating covert activity and reining it in, because most covert activity is illegal. So he's not going to do, and for years, this committee has been useless. They don't, like, for instance, the New York Times reported that the CIA has 12 bases in Ukraine. So, I mean, what the committee should do is order an investigation as to what is going on in these bases. How did the CIA help provoke the Maidan coup? How is it provoking conflict with Russia and possibly illegal activity? Because the CIA is training some of these Ukrainian commando units that have been carrying out assassinations, including of politicians in Russia. And this is potentially leading us to World War III. So I think a responsible committee would order an investigation of what these CIA bases are doing, what they're doing there, or what are they doing with the biolabs in Ukraine. That was already admitted to by Victoria Nuland. Or what are the CIA doing in Latin America? Like, as you said, with the Venezuelan government, there was a regime change operation to overthrow a legitimate government. And the CIA, it's already come out of the CIA role in training mercenary elements. So, I mean, a good congressional committee would launch an investigation. They have the power of subpoena, and they could get at the truth. like an individual reporter would have a hard time unearthing anything, they could find out the truth and order investigation of CIA operations, say in Venezuela. But with Tom Cotton, they're never going to do that. And in fact, I looked at most of the members of the committee, and they're all these staunch pro-war, people, and some are on the board in a complete conflict of interest. For instance, Todd Young, the Republican from Indiana, on that Senate Intelligence Committee, who is a member of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. That's a CIA front operation that carries out propaganda and provides grants to groups that are promoting regime change and insurrection, like in countries that the U.S. wants overthrown, like Venezuela. So that's a blatant conflict of interest. He should be removed immediately from the committee because he's loyal to the National Endowment for Democracy, when in fact the Senate Intelligence Committee should be investigating how the National Endowment for Democracy may be abusing taxpayer money to promote propaganda or insurrection in foreign countries. It's completely at odds with what the committee was set up to do. Even at the hearing, when they had the hearing for the new CIA director, Michael Bennett, who's on that committee, did admit that he said what the purpose of the committee was as a watchdog, but he, of course, did nothing to live up to it. And I looked on his website; he's got a photo of himself hugging Zelensky. So can we count on this guy to investigate what the CIA had been doing to prop up Zelensky or illegal activity to support Ukraine? No. But that's what they should be doing. That's what Frank Church set it up. And that's a system of separation of powers. That's the only way the American government will work, is if Congress actually investigates in the executive branch and needs intelligence agencies as to really what they're doing and if it's having a positive or negative effect. But they're not doing that at all. In fact, the hearing they had, Marco Rubio was for years on that committee, they were hosting hearings that were basically propagandizing the American public, inflating the threat of Russia and China to support huge military and intelligence budgets. That's a complete opposite of what Frank Church envisioned for that committee and what is in the interest of the American public. It's a disgrace, and I hope more people will be alert to how the American government, Congress, is not functioning for the people. And we need major changes in Congress if we ever hope to have a change in the CIA's policy.
Is there a struggle or a fight going on between Donald Trump and the intelligence state? Because as we look at his talking about releasing the files on the JFK assassination, the RFK assassination, and the assassination of Dr. King, if those files are released and if they are unredacted or minimally redacted, that's not going to bode well for the security apparatus, for the intelligence apparatus, for the CIA, for the FBI. And so one, to me, has to wonder, what is Trump's objective in taking this tact, if in fact he follows through on what he said he's going to do?
Well, my take on Trump is that he's a clever politician who understands the mood in the country, that there is a lot of skepticism toward what we can call the deep state or the intelligence agencies. So he makes like he's on this fight against them, and he's a target of their wrath. And there is some truth, because the Russiagate did target him, and he was, in a sense, a victim of that. And that was, I think, a deep state operation to ratchet up the political climate of the Cold War. On the other hand, though, I think Trump is really an instrument of the financial oligarchy and is a clever politician who knows how to manipulate public opinion and make like he's this victim and leading this crusade. But really, like with these documents, I think he's actually just going to release selectively certain documents. So it makes it look like, oh, Trump's getting the release of these documents, and we're going to know who killed JFK. Well, firstly, I researched those topics, and maybe we can discuss it on another show. but there's already a massive amount of evidence that it implicates Lyndon Johnson and a certain circle of CIA operatives who are around Texas in that assassination. There's also massive evidence about the Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. William Pepper was the King family lawyer, and he basically solved the case and exonerated James Earl Ray. So, I mean, yeah, documents could add new layers of detail, but it's very likely that he's just playing to an audience and trying to cultivate a certain image for himself, when actually what he's going to do is just, again, release very limited number of documents, and they'll be heavily redacted, and they might reveal certain nuggets of interest to historians, but the most serious documents they have, I think they'll still keep under wraps. And in general, look, the CIA director that Trump appointed, John Radcliffe, has a similar outlook to Tom Cotton. He wants to unleash the CIA. He's a cowboy who wants to unleash the CIA with more expanded covert operations around the world. So is Trump really at war with the deep state when he appoints a new CIA director who wants to expand the agency and carry out a new generation, revitalize the glory days of the 1950s? And I mean, Trump is the most gung-ho hawk as far as regime change in Latin America. And, maybe he's going to focus more on Mexico and targeting drug cartels or something. But I think it's just an image and an illusion that he's actually taking on the deep state. It's just like, he's a showman, Trump. He knows how to play to a certain crowd, and he's smart in sensing the mood. The mood of the public is to rein in these rogue agencies, and Trump is going to present himself as trying to do that, but really he's actually going to strengthen and revitalize them.
You mentioned that Trump is on the side of the financial oligarchy in this country. Who's on the other side? Who's on the other side of this fight?
Well, the people. We have to mobilize. We can't rely on any politician. I mean, most politicians are con men and charlatans, and Trump, I'd put him at the top of the list, but they're all the same. Whether it's Obama, they hoodwink the public, they make like they're on the people's side, and then we all know with Obama how he ran to the bankers, and at the end of his presidency, he gave a speech and said, "You should kiss my feet because I made you so much money." And he had packaged himself as candidate for hope and change.
And I'm the one standing between you and the people with the pitchforks.
Yeah. So I mean, this is just like a dog and pony show. We go through every cycle, a new liberal hero comes about, or a Trump type popular who presents himself as a populist. But this is a guy worth $6 billion who knows how to make money. And is going to use his fame just to make more and more money for his family. And he's going to cut. I mean, a lot of his policies favor. He's pretty open about his interest in cutting corporate tax rates. And in his first term, he cut the rate. He made it easier for the wealthy to offshore their money and to avoid paying taxes like he did. So that's the exact opposite of a real populist. A real populist was Huey Long. Was, I think, people should remember Huey Long. That's who we need. That's a real populist who came from the American heartland, Louisiana, with a share of the wealth program. And he was going to really tax the wealthy and redistribute wealth. And they assassinated him. He was the governor of Louisiana who was challenging Roosevelt from the left. But he spoke to the common people. He could reach them. And that's a real populist, and they killed him. But I mean, we need grassroots movements. We can't rely on or shouldn't believe any politician. They're just out for their power. So we need to form grassroots movements like Martin Luther King was developing before his assassination, interracial movements of the middle working class, for movements for more leftist economic program for the United States, an end to the warfare state. And just to bring people together. I think the game of the oligarchy is to divide people, to make you hate, divide people along partisan lines and play up these cultural issues. But I think we need a movement of people along class line, middle working class people just coming together for more progressive vision for America.
There's a Clifford Bristow says, I saw the funding for the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, has been included in the federal funding that was recently enacted. Is that true? I don't know the answer to that question, but if you could provide some insight into that, and also talk to the audience about the NED. Many people who hear National Endowment for Democracy think that this is some benevolent operation or organization that goes into countries and promotes democratic principles and candidates, when in fact that's about 180 degrees away from what it actually does.
Yeah, the National Endowment for Democracy was founded in the 1980s. And basically, it was founded to continue the work of the CIA, but openly, which was to finance like opposition figures in countries that that are adversaries of the United States, like Russia or China, and to finance intellectual journals that promote like anti-government position in those countries, or socialist countries like Venezuela or Belarus or North Korea. So NED are very active in those countries, and they'll fund media groups that promote anti-government positions. And they may try and influence world opinion against particular governments, usually leftist governments that want to take control over their natural resources, or the U.S. government wants them overthrown because they're more independent. They'll stand up to American interests in certain respects. So that's really what they do. And they specialize also in propaganda. And I think they're not supposed to operate in the United States, but they propagandize the American public. So that's why, members of their board, and it's used sometimes as a funnel for CIA covert operations, either directly or indirectly, to groups that are agitating for regime change, like in socialist countries. So to have members of the board of NED on the Senate Intelligence Committee, to me, is an outright conflict of interest, and they should be forced to resign from the Senate Intelligence Committee if they want to stay with the NED. And as far as I think that they get their funding, you'd have to look into how NED gets their funding. I do believe Congress appropriates some money every year. They also raise some revenue through private financing. And they do have notorious CIA figures on their board, like Maurice Templesman was on their board. He was a diamond magnate who's a big donor to the Democratic Party, who was involved with shady CIA covert operations in Africa, going back to the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in 1960. And he was very close with the CIA station chief in Congo, and his company made a fortune in diamond mining. And he's still on their board. He's in their 90s. He's in his 90s. I believe he's still on the board of NED today.
Also, the current mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, was on the board. Which and you know, when I take issue with her, people say to me, Wilmer, why are you? I say, y'all need to understand Karen Bass's history. And if you and well, in fact, let me take a step back before I get into all that. And that is, you mentioned that the NAD now just is openly and blatantly carries on the undermining work of the CIA. And people need to understand that when you look at Mossadegh in Iran, when you look at the overthrow of, I think it was Arbenz in Guatemala, that the first thing that the CIA did back then was they would go to newspapers in those countries and they would plant stories about those individuals and nefarious actions or illegal actions or immoral actions that they were involved in. They would sow these seeds of discord through media outlets in the countries where they wanted to overthrow the president or the prime minister. And now because a lot of people don't realize that those were some of the tactics that the CIA would employ, and now it's the NED that does that on behalf of the CIA. And so, if Karen Bass was on the board of directors of the NED, I don't have a whole lot of space and a whole lot of tolerance for that.
Yeah, exactly. And I was very disappointed because I was trying to serve as a watchdog of the NED and writing articles about what they were doing. And I was very disappointed that they had an event and Barbara Lee gave the keynote address and was very pro-NED. And she was the main congressman who opposed the war on terror by voting, was the only one to vote against the permanent war authorization. But it was disappointing to see her. And I share your disappointment. Yeah. Well, firstly, a mayor, it shouldn't be on that because her job is to improve the quality of life for residents of LA. So what is she doing on this board of this agency?
I don't think she's there now. I know
well, she was.
She was on the board.
Yeah, and that raised suspicion as to how they might be. What her connections are.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's a very nefarious organization, and they've been linked with like far right groups. Like in Venezuela, they keep bringing this guy Leopoldo Lopez.
Mm-hmm.
He was the one in 2012. He organized these violent protests north of the Guarimba, where they were like burning buildings and cars, and he was accused of acts of terrorism in Venezuela that resulted in like lynchings, and Chavez supporters were lynched or violently attacked by his followers, and he was arrested for incitement of violence, and he had to flee to Spain. And he comes from like a Spanish royalist descent, and it's like the far right in Venezuela, and he'd been implicated in these violent insurrectionist movements of the far right. And NED is celebrating him as this political prisoner and great freedom champion, and that's very dubious. And they bring out other like far right leaders in Latin America who have seem to have fascist proclivities, and that's reminiscent of the Cold War, in the 80s when the CIA allied with fascist type death squad operators in South American countries. So I think any progressives should steer clear of the NED, and if they're part of it or giving speeches, it really raises questions about them, such as Barbara Lee, who one thinks of as one of the good people in American politics. But
and to that point, as an African American, and one scratches their head saying, well, where is the Congressional Black Caucus in, because they were at their inception deemed the conscience of the Congress. But when you now look at, well, when Karen Bass was on the CBC, she was on the board of the NED. You look at, again, you mentioned Barbara Lee and others who we thought or always attributed or associated left progressive politics with. You can't serve two masters. You can't be on the payroll of AIPAC, and then people are expecting you to stand up in opposition to the atrocities in Gaza, a la Kamala Harris. You can't be receiving or what's his name, Hakeem Jeffries. When you understand you're on the payroll of the NED, when you understand that you're on the payroll of AIPAC, then you can understand why Kamala Harris would go to CARICOM, trying to convince CARICOM to be the black face on American imperialism on the colonization of Haiti, for example. I mean, when you start connecting those dots, then you get an understanding of why certain policy gets supported and why certain policy does not.
Yeah, and it goes to show you can trust almost nobody in Washington because, you think some are progressives, but at the end of the day, they'll, they may be just, calculating politicians who are cultivating a certain image for themselves when really they serve a different master. And that's what you find of almost every politician unfortunately. And I think, I mean, you would know the history better than me, but the Congressional Black Caucus has had a lot of leaders who really sold out, especially when it comes to U.S. foreign policy in Africa. They've often aligned with some really regressive forces in Africa that the U.S. government was supporting. So you find that tendency all too often as well. And I know, with Barbara Lee, she was a gung-ho supporter, I think, of the Ukraine war and NATO. And that's true of people who are progressive, like on some issues, like in the Middle East, have tended to be awful when it comes to NATO and Ukraine. Like even Bernie Sanders and AOC have been pretty staunch supporters of NATO and the billions of dollars going to Ukraine. So it's hard to find anybody who's purely good in politics.
Do you have time for one more question?
Absolutely.
Okay, because Lil Marco, Secretary of State Lil Marco Rubio, now is talking about there needs to be an end to the war in Ukraine. He's talking about Putin has to compromise. He's on the one hand articulating a lot of the statements or reiterating a lot of the statements that Donald Trump made on the campaign trail, but at the same time seems to be making demands that just make no sense. This really seems to be a matter of surrender as opposed to a peace agreement. And now President Putin is saying, I'm thinking about selecting some negotiators, but I'm in no position. In fact, let me read the headline. This is from Sputnik. Russia ready to pick negotiators for direct talks with Zelensky, but he can't sign a peace deal. Jeremy.
Well, who can't sign the peace deal?
Putin.
Oh, well, because they're not offering anything reasonable. And, Trump was a lot of talk. I mean, I think, again, Trump is a very clever, kind of savvy politician. He saw that the mood in the public, and including among the Republican base, saw no purpose to continuing the war in Ukraine. I mean, what is America getting out of all those weapons, the billion in weapons? Russia has taken.
Lockheed Martin's getting an awful lot.
Yeah.
McDonnell Douglas and Boeing.
Well, exactly. But okay. The American public is getting nothing. So, I mean, they want it over. And a lot of conservatives, see it as a waste of money. So, I mean, Trump, just did the typical thing of politicians. I mean, and I tell students, go over this in the history when I teach my course in U.S. history. 1916, Woodrow Wilson campaign on the platform. He kept us out of the war. Then he took the U.S. into World War I. FDR campaigned as a peace candidate. He said no American boys would ever serve another world war, and that was the 1940 campaign. And then Lyndon Johnson, 1964 campaign, was a peace candidate, presented Barry Goldwater, this extreme war hawk, and then he escalated the Vietnam War after the election. So, I mean, Trump is no different. He packaged himself as a peace candidate on Ukraine. It's an unpopular war among most of the public and especially conservatives, middle America. But now he's not delivering because, as you say, Lockheed Martin making too much money off that, and BlackRock, and and really Trump is a tool of that financial oligarchy. Now his own design may be more on China and Iran. So I think we may just see a kind of low intensity war persist in Ukraine, and that would the interest of the so-called deep state, or the U.S. power elite. They wanted to bleed. I think their strategy was to provoke a Russian intervention in Ukraine, just like in Afghanistan in the 80s when they armed the Mujahideen well in advance of the Soviet invasion, to bankrupt the Soviet Union, get it bogged down in a long-standing conflict, ratchet up sanctions, play up the evil of the Russians in the media, and try and isolate Russia and ultimately undermine the Putin government. So I think they're continuing with that strategy, and Trump is just kind of window dressing for his base. But although I read an article today that Russia's economy is growing significantly, even despite the sanctions. So, the strategy is not really working, but on the other hand, all these companies still make huge amount of money. So it's like, why not keep it going? You know, I mean, Palantir has the contract for the AI. You know, Ukraine has been a real, as much as Israel, Gaza, it's been like a testing ground for new AI battlefield systems. And Palantir, the big profiteer and all that, and they financed J.D. Vance's career. So,
final question on that whole front is: do you think Lil Marco, and along with the Trump administration, they're trying to find a spin on this? And what I mean by that is, it's obvious that the war is over. It's obvious to me anyway that Ukraine is done. But the United States cannot accept or cannot have anybody talk about defeat. So they're trying to put lipstick on this pig and trying to find an honorable way out of this that makes it appear as though the United States did not suffer the brutal whipping that the United States suffered.
Yeah, they'll always try and spin it somehow positively, but I mean, they've been running out of anything good to say. I mean, the Ukrainian army is totally decimated. You know, I've been reading articles in the New York Times discussing how Ukrainian youth are afraid to go to concerts because they're going to be kidnapped by army agents and send them to a certain death on the front lines.
Right.
Clearly, Ukrainians don't want to serve. A huge number don't want to serve. I think they've had to expand the ages. They have agents kidnapping Ukrainians even outside the country, I believe. But that goes to show it can't go on inevitably because they're running out of people to fight. And I mean, what have they gained? The biggest loser is Ukrainian themselves. They've lost 20% of their country. A lot of their country is being bought over by Wall Street firm, a lot of their land. And the flower of their youth has sadly been lost. And, you know, it's so sad, much like in World War I, when just an entire generation of youth was lost to us senselessly. And it's too bad so many liberals went along with this war, because there should have been a bigger pushback. And it's a really major error that these liberals made going along with that war for so long. And I don't know if they'll ever be willing to admit that they support the Vietnam type war.
Well, Peace in the World gives us a $20 super sticker. Thank you very much. And Peace in the World says, thank you as always, doctor, and should be doctors, and guest, for the brilliant insight. And Peace in the World, all I do is bring on the brilliant minds and give them the space to articulate. I just kind of stand in the shadow and bask in the glow of brilliant folks like Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. Jeremy, man, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. The audience loved you as always. And Vera, thank you for your compliments. And Jeremy, look forward to having you back.
Great. Well, thank you for the kind compliments. I appreciate it. And I'll be happy to come back.
They are well earned, sir.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. All right. So again, I got to thank Dr. Kuzmarov. Thank you so much for joining me today. Folks, thank you all for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned. New episodes every day. And guess what? We are going to have Scott Ritter on tomorrow. We are going to have Scott Ritter with us tomorrow. Please follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show. We got to get to 10,000. If we can keep this thing moving, we've got to get to 10,000, and we can't do that without you. Follow us on social media. You can see all the links below in the show description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.